Hello, welcome. My name is Joshua Chuang. I'm the curator of this exhibition, Judith Joy Ross, Photographs, 1978 to 2015. It's a retrospective that covers 4 decades of this very significant American photographer's work. I have known Judith for about 20 years and have been working with her archive for the past almost 10 years. And so it's been an immense privilege of mine to have worked with Judith and with the Humphrey Foundation to stage this exhibition. I'm really excited about this because it's the first time that we'll be able to see the full sweep of her work. There are many pictures here, many pictures here that are on view here and published in the catalog for the very first time. So it's a chance for us all to discover the sweep of her work. If you don't know the name Judith Joy Ross, that's okay. This exhibition is an incredible introduction to her achievement. For those of you who do know Judith's work, there are also many surprises in store. So what makes Judith really quite distinctive in her portraiture is that she registers both intimacy and distance at the same time. She tries not to judge the people she photographs. Instead, she tries to relate to them. And she photographs mainly strangers she passes on the street, strangers that she meets at rest stops. Her encounters with the people she photographs are generally quite short. And she's said before that she falls in love briefly with the person she's photographed, makes the picture, and then she never sees them again. So there's really a wonderful kind of tension in her work. So this picture, which we've used as the banner for the exhibition, is actually the most recent picture in the show. It was made in 2015. She calls it Persephone, after the figure in Greek mythology, who's basically the goddess of the underworld, of death. Here, she is looking at the viewer. She's looking at Judith. She's holding a phone, whose case has a skull on it. She has this look of surprise, as if she's just emerged from a sort of fantasy, but she's here in reality, and she's here to guide us through this exhibition. One of the aspects that I wanted to bring out in this retrospective is Judith's work before she starts using her 8x10 view camera. So like many of the photographers of her generation, she became really interested in seeing the world through the frame of a view camera. She acquired that camera in 1981, but before that, she was making pictures with smaller cameras. Judith generally makes contact prints. So these are prints made by placing a piece of photographic paper in contact with the negative. So in this case, the negative is the same size as the print. So the pictures have a very intimate quality to them. The prints themselves have this incredible continuous tone. They really are these, she calls them reflections. These are pictures, the people in her pictures are looking into her camera as if looking into a mirror, but they can't see themselves in the mirror, but she can see them. So we have here early pictures of Judith's work that really were made in and around the places where she lived. These are places that are not far flung. These are places that were important to her own biography. And you can see the difference between these early pictures and her first real pictures made with the 8x10 view camera. In the earlier pictures, we saw a kind of way of kind of relating to people, a way of relating to the world that becomes much more serious, I think, and much more collaborative with the view camera. And we see this with this series called Urena Park. Urena Park was a park in rural Pennsylvania where she herself used to play when she was a kid. And her visitation or revisitation of this park happened when her father passed away. And this was a tremendous turning point in her life. She felt like she had to somehow reconnect with something that he had passed down to her, and he used to bring her and her brothers to this park. She was asking herself this question of, what is the meaning of life? And trying to find the answer to that question through photography. And in the case of Urena Park, she found meaning through photographing these children, these adolescents, in various stages of innocence and loss thereof. They're incredible pictures of this moment in these kids' lives that is in a state of transition. They're changing, the photographer is changing, and she's able to capture this almost magical world through the lives of these children. There's a kind of innocence about them. I personally love the way that she's able to project a clearer view onto these people. She's not projecting herself into these pictures. She's trying to really see what these people are about with these very brief encounters. This picture is another favorite of mine. We've put it on the cover of the catalog. It's a picture of a swimmer who's just emerged from a lake that's on the premises of Urena Park. And she has this almost, she looks like a statue, but she's pulsating. She's this living person. We don't know anything about her, but at the same time, everything about her we need to know is in the picture. Something very mysterious about that. After Urena Park, she starts to broaden out her questions, these larger questions she's asking. And one of the things that she had avoided doing with Urena Park was photographing adults, because in this question of how do you find meaning in life, and thinking about the death of her father, it was very difficult to confront adults because she could see the pain in their faces. She wanted to see something different. But after Urena Park, she was able to broaden out her inquiry to a broader swath of people. So you have a sampling here of people at the grocery store, people at swimming pools, people watching a parade. And as she started photographing adults and a larger range of people, she started asking larger questions. How do you deal with pain and suffering? She was thinking about stopping people she met on the street with her view camera and asking that question and making their picture. But then she heard on the radio about the opening of Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. And she thought, no, that's the place where I need to ask that question. That's the place where I'm going to find my subject. So for 2 summers, she went and traveled from her home in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, to Washington, D.C., and found people that she wanted to photograph and asked them, as they were looking at the wall, if she could make their picture. And as a result, this series emerged. And it was the first series that brought her widespread attention. She showed this work to curators at the Museum of Modern Art in New York. John Tchaikovsky there made a selection of them and showed them in the first new photography exhibition in 1985. And so that brought her widespread attention and sort of put her on the map as a photographer. She takes the momentum from this breakthrough and begins a project of almost impossible ambition, which is to photograph members of Congress, members of the United States Congress, and their aides. So while she was photographing the Vietnam Veterans Memorial, she was asking these questions about, who are these people in power that allowed such a war to happen? And she thought, am I making too many assumptions about these people in power? Maybe the way to really see, to sort of test my own assumptions, is to photograph them. So she started this campaign, months-long campaign of letter writing. We have, in this case, an example of one of the letters she wrote to try to get a portrait session. So everything in this exhibition, and actually in this case, are from her archive. And over the period of a year, she was able to photograph 117 congresspeople in 1986 and 1987. This is a project that I don't think anyone could accomplish today. There was at the time, it was the Iran-Contra affair, so there was quite a lot of tension within these halls. She wanted to photograph them in their offices, in the hallways of the place where they worked, because she felt like that's where she could actually see them. And I think she was able to actually get incredible results. These are pictures in which you cannot make assumptions about the people you're looking at, but yet at the same time, they're exactly who they are. There's this Congressman John Hyler, who was a young congressman from Indiana. He was a Republican. And I think you can see in his face a combination of him trying to project a sense of authority, propriety, but at the same time, I think you can also look in his eyes and see that he's also vulnerable. There's a sense of almost a fear in him. And I think these pictures really bring out a kind of vulnerability, even of people like Strom Thurmond, who was a well-known racist. And the year she photographed him in 1987, he was the president pro tempore, which means that he was third in line for the presidency. And it's just, now in hindsight, it's not so crazy to think about someone with those kind of values in the office, but that tells you how close, that tells you a lot about the situation. But you look at his face, and he looks, again, both noble, very old, but also there's this incredible delicacy, vulnerability in the way that Ross portrays him. But keep in mind, they had all the power, she did not. And in the photograph, she's able to equalize that relationship and make these extraordinary pictures. Let's go to the other floor. So we're now downstairs at the Mopfrey Foundation space, and we're in the really second part of the show. So Judith had just finished this project, photographing congressmen, but she was going back and forth between issues of national importance to issues of personal importance. And one of those motifs was this town of Nanticoke, Pennsylvania. This is a town that's so small, most people have never heard of it, but it's a town where her father operated a variety shop where they sold notebooks, pencils, dresses, little things you need around the house. They called them five and dimes. And he operated a chain of them around Northeast Pennsylvania. But this very store was the one of Judith's favorite when she was growing up. So Her father died in 1981. This is 4 years later. She goes back to this town and photographs it. And I think you can see, even though her father does not appear in the pictures, they're all about him, and all about her relationship to him. So here is a vacant storefront near her father's shop. There's, it's a very unusual picture in Judith's body of work. Most of the picture is dark and almost illegible. There's a void, which I think speaks to the void that Judith herself was feeling. And then she made a series of pictures in a very, very small diner where her father used to take her to lunch. You can imagine Judith in this very small diner with this very large camera. She must have been quite a presence there, but she was so familiar with the place and so familiar with the place in her memory that there's an incredible sense of, again, intimacy with her portrayal of this diner. Again, they're even in places, in pictures in which no people appear, they're a kind of portrait. So I think we're beginning to see a sort of another motif emerge here, which is the everyday and the commonplace. So Judith has always dedicated herself to trying to see people on the same level as her. She grew up in a working class family, and that's the class of person that she's most able to relate to. So they became her primary subject. Again, these are people that she's doesn't know very well, most of the time strangers, but through these encounters with them and with her camera, she's able to extract something about their state of being that's remarkable. And that goes for people who are on a wedding day, people waiting at bus stops, kids playing in a baseball game. These three pictures are also about people, about her memories of this place and watching her father actually plant these trees as twigs in the ground and visiting them a few decades later, and they've grown into these massive willow trees. One of her influences in photography is the French photographer Eugène Atget, and you can really see that in these three pictures. We'll go into this large room. This is the largest room of the exhibition. And we're now in the year 1990. Judith had taught for about 15 years, taught photography in a small liberal arts college in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. But by this time, she had stopped teaching, and she was actually earning income as a house cleaner. And I think that might have something to do with her interest in portraying people, again, working class people, going about their work. And the picture that led her to create a whole series of this work was this picture, simply called Mike, in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania. Again, Bethlehem is where Judith was living. We don't know anything about this person, and yet when you look at the picture carefully, it's almost like you know everything about him. The way he's crossed his arms, the way he has his sleeves rolled up, the way he's looking into this distance almost stoically. We can project ourselves, I think, onto these people, and vice versa. He's an everyman, but he's also incredibly specific in where he is in life. We have these two pictures of women that Judith encountered in her daily life. This was a woman who was an assistant in the doctor's office where she went, and this is a cop she's encountered on the street. And again, quite miraculous, being able to look almost transparently into the lives of these people in this very moment. This was a kitchen worker in the cafeteria where she used to eat. Volunteer fireman in a small town where she spent summers. And a young man who was working at the desk at a car rental agency. I think another thing that makes Judith's portraits remarkable is that you can, in the best of them, it's almost as if you can see not just the present of the subject, but something about the past and maybe something about the future as well of the people in her photographs. So just as she was photographing children whose lives were in transition upstairs in Urena Park, in the same year, 1990, she made a series of pictures, actually over 2 days, of civilians, men and women, who were reservists in the army, and suddenly they were called to duty to go into the Persian Gulf to fight this war. And in this one day, they shed their civilian clothes, put on their army clothes. They were being vaccinated and shipped overseas. And in this very moment, their lives were about to change, and they knew this, and they allowed Judith to photograph them. So she started thinking about events in the round. So not just civilians going off to fight a battle, to fight a war far away, but also the people back home who were supporting the troops. And these were 3 people who Judith encountered at rallies to support the troops. And again, we think we know what we're looking at when we hear the title, that you're supporting the troops, you're at a war rally, but when you look into the faces of these people, you see something much more complicated. In the mid-90s, Judith began a project of a different kind of ambition. So again, thinking about her own life. She wanted to photograph inside the schools, the public schools that she attended when she was a kid. She was worried that people were complaining so much about the taxes they paid and about how high they were, that they didn't realize the value of their taxes towards education. And so she wanted to make a series of pictures that would show the value of people's tax dollars at work. But when she made pictures, she got something both familiar to her own experience and something that probably didn't quite achieve what she had intended in terms of a agenda. I think she's again got this incredible realist sense of what it's like to be at school. When you think about school pictures that you typically see, in the United States we have this tradition of high school yearbooks, and generally the pictures of students and teachers having a good time, everyone's smiling, everyone is creating memories. Judith's pictures show the real experience of being in school, which is full of awkwardness, tenderness. There's some sense of boredom as well. She decided to focus not just on the kids, but also some of the teachers. And I feel like no matter where you went to school, if you really look into these pictures, there's something that you can relate to that is real. So we're now in the late 90s, and Judith Joy Ross turns 50 years old, and she starts to think about a series in which she's thinking about the future of these people, what their lives are going to be like 50 years later. And so she calls this series 2046. And it's probably the most varied series in terms of its subject matter. But when you think about who you're looking at and projecting to the future what their lives are going to be like in 50 years, I think it makes you look at the pictures quite differently. These are two of my favorite pictures in the exhibition, quite telling about I think they're telling about Judith's view of humanity. There's something quite unlikely, but also lovely about these two friends. Will these two girls be friends 50 years from now? Will they know each other's names? They seem like the closest of friends now. And there's something also so unlikely, but so natural about this group of girls who just happen to be gathered together in these pictures. Judith generally never arranges people in her pictures. When they see her, when they see her so excited about making this picture, they arrange themselves, and she just simply trips the shutter. But Judith also wanted to challenge herself, not just to photograph the familiar, but also the unfamiliar. So in the late 90s, she ventures into inner city Philadelphia, in this case, Northeast Philadelphia, and goes to photograph kids in these parks. And I think this is quite an extraordinary picture. There is a sense of tentativeness, both on the part of the photographer and of the subjects. They're looking at the photographer quite warily, like, what are you doing photographing us? She herself, I think, doesn't quite know what she's going to capture. There's something quite remarkable about this moment. She ended up staying in this park and making individual pictures. That's what we see in these later works. And they began to trust her. They began to open themselves up to her. Here, you almost can't find two subjects that are more different than each other. But she sees them both with a kind of mixture of steeliness and tenderness. So I've spoken about Judith's work as personal. This room here is maybe the most personal of her body of work. These two pictures are of out the window of her apartment in Allentown, out the back door of her current house in Bethlehem. And we have a suite of pictures here, also shown for the first time, of her family cottage in Rockport, Pennsylvania. This is where she grew up. This is where she spent summers with her family, camping in the yard, listening to the sounds of animals in the woods. By this time, her mother was fading away. And so she's photographing this place, not quite nostalgically, but trying to find a crystallization of her own experience and her own memory of this place. There's something both clear-eyed about it, but also full of emotional depth. Again, we don't need to know much about these pictures, but there's something quite particular about them. And she invests her relationship with this place in the pictures, and I think as a result, we can feel that ourselves as viewers. This span of pictures was made in a town called Freeland, and this is where her father was born. It's a hard-scrabble town, quite small. There's a few pictures here made in trailer parks. So it's quite a poor township. It's a town where there's kind of locally, famously, more bars than there are churches. But she doesn't judge, she doesn't condescend. Let's go to the final two rooms. So 9/11, I think, is an event that many of us can remember. So many of us remember where we were when we heard about the attacks on New York City and Washington, D.C. Judith herself was at her family cottage in Rockport, and when she heard about the bombs, about the planes going into the towers, she, like everyone else, was just in a state of shock. A few days later, she does the only thing I think she could do as an artist, and she goes to this lookout in suburban New Jersey where people would go to look at the skyline of Manhattan. Only the day that she was there, people had gathered to look at the void where the Twin Towers once stood. And she looked at the void with them. She had her camera with her. And she would just look at the pathos in the faces of the people. And as she found people whose faces and gestures seemed to capture something about that moment, she would silently ask them if she could take their picture. These are, when you think about it, these are pictures that are quite oblique in talking about the terrorist attacks, but they're also incredibly moving. We're seeing the impact of this profound tragedy as reflected in the faces and the gestures of these people. And we're able to extract this sadness that we also share. She went back a number of times to this lookout over that fall and made a larger series of pictures. This is just a small selection. A few days after making the initial picture of that series, she found out about these teenagers who had been flown in from northern Uganda before 9/11. They've been flown in to speak to the United Nations about the civil war that was ongoing in northern Uganda. And when 9/11 happened, they were stranded in New York. Their plans had been canceled, but they also couldn't leave. There were no flights going back. So she arranged to meet them in Washington Square Park and made their picture. This one of Otima Alimadi Samuel. He's 15 years old. He was a former child soldier. So you can imagine having been forced to be a child soldier and the terrible things he must have been forced to do. And then being flown into New York, which should have been the promised land, only to be there during the terrorist attacks and to have yourself photographed by this woman you don't know. Miraculously, I think Judith's able to get this very special picture that is really about multiple tragedies, multiple traumas impressed upon each other. Through these portraits, she began becoming interested in the plight of immigrants from Africa to other places. Her brother Edward was living in Paris, and so she decided to use Paris as her base. And so she went to Paris starting in 2003 with her view camera and started photographing people that she would meet in the streets. And eventually this span of subjects broadened out to friends of her brother. This is a portrait of the photographer's brother, with whom she had a tender but also difficult relationship with. I think you could see some of that in the picture. And two portraits of her brother's roommate, Seydou Camara. I'm just really struck by this very complex picture of Seydou sitting in this living room with this light. His face is in shadow. His eyes have this almost blank look to them. It's almost like he's a receptacle for our own fears, our own feelings, our own questions about where we are in this world. Incredibly powerful pictures. So we're in the final room of the exhibition, and we see Judith become interested again in the rituals of American life. In this case, casting your vote at national elections. So she started photographing the election process starting in 1996, and then photographed it every 4 years during presidential elections, focusing both on Democratic and Republican sides. And again, like the portraits of the congressmen and women, you can't prejudge these people. I think even though Judith sympathizes more with the Democratic platform, you can see there's also a kind of interior look at the machinery of the Democratic platform. Pennsylvania is well known to be a swing state, so every time there's a presidential election of some import, you see people come in from all over the country to try to sway the election, to try to get people to vote for their side. And Judith wanted to sort of see through that into the sort of personal and the everyday ritual that voting really is. So this is a very important picture for her, even though it might be more understated to those of us who are new to her work. These are all neighbors of hers, and for her, this is real life. All her pictures are real life, and it's just that for her, photography helps her to see life clearly. So in 2006, Judith became interested in looking at the faces of people who were basically sacrificing their days, their afternoons, their weekends, standing outside and protesting against the war in Iraq. Like the pictures of voters, there's an incredible sense of everydayness in these portraits. They are both ordinary, but also transportative out of the ordinary into something that speaks to this extraordinary moment where they're putting themselves on the line to make a stand. I think you can also see in these pictures a vulnerability. When we go about our daily lives, we're on a rush to maybe go to work, and we see protesters on the street standing for something. It's easy to think of them as maniacs or people who have nothing better to do. But I think you see in these pictures, these are people just like us who have convictions, who have chosen to put their convictions on the line for a cause. And she saw incredible strength, but also incredible vulnerability in these people. We end the show with two small groups of pictures that show her broadening out her view. In 2006, she drove across the country by herself to take part in this great American tradition of the road trip, and decided that she wanted to photograph people that she met at rest stops, and her other stops along the way. Again, she didn't know these people, but I think it's captured something of the American spirit in these pictures of strangers. So as you go through the exhibition, you'll notice, if you look closely, a very special quality about these prints. And it's not just because they're contact prints, it's also because she privileged this printing process called printing out paper that no longer exists. And in fact, in 2008, the printing out paper ceased to be commercially manufactured, which means the paper she depended on for 4 decades, she could no longer depend on. So she took that as a moment and an opportunity to start photographing in color. So we have just a few of her color pictures in the exhibition that I think show in their handling of color, the handling of light, the handling of space, a slightly different language, but still the same voice. And we see in these two pictures here, also a different kind of more oblique view of a subject. They're not strictly portraits, but they are portraits of a particular environment that are animated by people. This is a picture made of an old bank building where her family had a business. And even though she didn't know the man in the elevator, there's this sense that she's very familiar with this place, and she's allowing us to see something of that connection. These two portraits were made in the town of Nanticoke, which we visited in an earlier room. This was a former pilot who must have been quite a robust man in his prime, and by the time Judith photographs him in 2014, he seems almost softened by time, almost worn away. And in the same town, the same year, she encounters this woman, and Judith calls this picture the Madonna of the Northeast. And I think you see in that picture quite a remarkable mixture of toughness and vulnerability that speaks, I think, a lot to our time. She looks like she knows more about the world than she should know at her age, but there's no sugarcoating the world in Judith's pictures, and I think this picture really speaks to that. The exhibition ends with this picture of a young man who is looking at a baseball game, and there's a thunderstorm coming on. We know that from the title. The picture does a couple of different things. I mean, he's got this almost innocent look on his face. He's enjoying this game that's about to end because of the storm. It's quite a knowing, but at the same time enigmatic picture. And it's the picture that we wanted to end the show on, because I think it's both specific and enigmatic, and it really asks this question of where we're headed as a society and as individuals. And I think that's what Judith's work helps us to see, helps us to understand about our own lives and how we relate to the world, and how we relate to ourselves and each other. So thanks so much for joining me on this tour. Please come to the exhibition. I think you'll really like it.